We downstairs are going to go into our passage in a few moments and then straight into the message, and then we're going to have a time to worship the Lord, and then after that you'll see the emblems laid out before us. We're going to come around the Lord's table. Today's passage, and I've already mentioned one or two things, it causes us to consider the most common fear that we will all face. The most common fear that we will all face to some degree or another. Of course, we all have fears, and each of us will have different fears. Something that causes one of us to fear will be no problem to another person. For example, Emma, spiders. Very fearful of spiders, hates spiders. Picked it up from her mum, I expect, because I've seen Ali as well with a spider or two, and they don't get on. They run in opposite directions. But Emma has a fear of spiders. In fact, there was one occasion when we were sat in Honiton and we'd gone into a cafe, and they had opened the gardens at the back of the cafe, and we'd gone to sit out there, but because I'm a man of receding hair, it's gone. I sit underneath a parasol now, and this parasol was a large one that stretched out over many tables, and we sat down underneath it, but it had obviously only just been opened up, because as I was sat there, a spider descended and landed upon what it obviously misconstrued as terra firma, and landed there. And Emma, of course, what she could see from her perspective, being slightly lower of me, was a spider slowly doing the old, and I didn't feel it because no sense, no feeling and all that, but eventually it came down and it was working its way down between my glasses and my eyeball, and it sort of got in there, and at that point I'm obviously aware there's a spider there, and Emma is like, there's a spider on your head, and it's the worst thing I think for someone with a fear of spiders, to see it actually climbing over someone, and I was like, is it? Oh yeah. And I was like, what do I do? How do I get it off? So I just went like this, and it fell down onto the table. At that point Emma did this. And all the menus and the drinks menus and everything, it went scattering off the table. Whether the spider went or not, we don't know. We didn't see it again. But that's because Emma has a fear of spiders. You know, if you told me that, hey, listen, I want us to go out for the weekend and we're going to go do some potholing, I would say, no way. No way. I'm not claustrophobic, but I don't want to slather between two bits of rock in a tiny gap. That's not doing it for me. That would make me entirely fearful, I can tell you. Just the thought of it makes me feel a little bit slightly on edge. We've all got different fears. We've all got different things that someone else might think, well, that's weird, or why are you scared of that? Different fears. But today's passage introduces to us a fear that affects us all to some degree or another, and at different points, different seasons in our life. Several weeks ago, we spent some time, and it was several weeks ago now, reflecting upon the events that led up to the moment when Joseph and his brothers were reunited. That moment of reconciliation, that moment of sweet embrace, when the brothers, not knowing how Joseph would treat them, showed love and compassion and kindness in that final moment of reconciliation. And alongside that moment when they're reunited, Joseph gives his brothers a very specific set of instructions concerning his father and his father's household. They're to go back to their land and to return to Egypt with Jacob and all the household, to Egypt, where they would be provided for, where they would be protected, and where they would be preserved during the years of famine that still remained, and indeed many years after that. But from Jacob's perspective, as the brothers return with these instructions that he is to leave the land he has known all his life and to go to Egypt, it was about stepping into the unknown. Stepping into the unknown. Now, we see the threads of this story coming together, and if we've read about the story of Joseph, if we've read the end of Genesis, we know where this story is going. But we ought not let that rob us of seeking to understand Jacob's perspective, that this request and this set of instructions not only is overwhelming because he's discovered his son, long thought dead, is alive, but now he is to leave everything he has known and go to be with him in a foreign land. He's well advanced in years, and this must have been unsettling and overwhelming, and he is about to leave everything he has known for something that is unknown. And I wonder how often our steps are restricted or perhaps entirely inhibited because the power that the fear of the unknown can hold over us. We're so concerned by the what-ifs. We're so concerned by the myriad of eventualities that we start to run through in our mind because we don't know what's going to happen. And that fear of unknown can be very powerful in our thinking and in our doing. I know, personally speaking, that I have been influenced and impacted by that fear so much in life. And particularly in my early 20s as well. I remember one occasion I went off to Poland on my own, and without being too dramatic, that was about me going to battle with the fear of the unknown, because I was so inhibited in so many ways. And I recognized that I needed to do something about this, and so I was fearful about the idea of going off traveling on my own. But it's something I needed to do because I was so fearful of everything, because of the unknown. It can have real power over us. And as we read Genesis 46, I want us to recognize the problem. I want us to name it. I want us to see that what Jacob encounters is a fear of what is unknown to him, and leaving the comfort of what is known to him. I want us to name it. I want us to see it, because when we better understand the problems we face, we can begin to see how God would seek to help us through these things. And that's exactly what God wants to do. It's exactly what God does for Jacob in this moment of fear for him. And I believe it's what God wants to do for us, to help us in these moments of fear, to lead us not out of that place, but through that place. And that's what we discover in our passage this morning. A God who is graciously at work, not just in orchestrating the big picture. We're conscious of the big picture. From Genesis 37 through to 50, the story of Joseph, we can see what God is doing. We know what God is doing. We see it when we understand the story in all its wholeness. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that God is in at work in the lives of the people that he's touching and using at this time. Working tenderly in the lives of these people, and in this case in Jacob's life. So we're picking up in Genesis 46, and we're just going to read the first 7 verses. Genesis 46 and the first 7 verses. And this is the response to the instructions that Joseph has given to his brothers in returning to Jacob. And they are instructed to head to Egypt, where they'll be protected, provided for, and preserved. And it says this. It says Israel, of course speaking of Jacob. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again. And Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. Then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry them. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. Jacob and all of his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters. All his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. Well, that's our passage, and may the Lord bless it to us as we reflect upon it and as we come to this fear that Jacob encounters on the road. There are a few occasions in the Bible when we see and hear God suddenly calling out to his servants by name. Samuel is an example. Samuel was called by God, Samuel, Samuel. It was only after his confusion had abated and realized it wasn't Eli calling his name that eventually Samuel stopped, stayed where he was, and said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Similarly, Paul, or then called Saul as he was, we read about in the New Testament, was on the road to Damascus. He was on his way to Damascus with the intent to persecute Christians, those who claimed to belong to Christ and walked in the way of Christ. He was going to persecute them, to see them arrested, imprisoned, beaten, maybe even killed. And yet on that journey, God calls out, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And then there's Abraham, one of Jacob's forebears. Abraham, his grandfather. God called out to him at a time of the testing of his faith. God called out, Abraham, Abraham. He gave him instructions to take his son and to sacrifice him as an offering to God. And of course, Abraham, confused by this, but conceiving with faith that God could bring his son back from the dead, followed faithfully the instructions God gave. Then came another call. Abraham, Abraham. God provided a substitute for his son. Think about these instances when God called out and the crises that these people were facing, the moments in their life that were real crossroad moments for them, and then a word came from God. A word that, into the context of these three examples, seems to have made all the difference. Samuel became a distinguished leader who bridged the gap between the judges and the kings. Saul the persecutor, his life was transformed when God called out to him in this way. The great persecutor became the great missionary, an apostle for Christ Jesus, telling people about the good news of Jesus Christ. And Abraham grew to become a giant of faith, not flawless, but a giant of faith that the writer of Hebrews should speak of him in such a way that he would become an example to us of trusting in the Lord. And so when we come to our passage this morning and hear God call out to his servant, we want to heed these words. We want to see the impact that they have upon the servant that God is speaking to. And why these words are so poignant, why it is that God has interjected like this, in this way, into the life of Jacob at this time. Just as he's commencing his journey to Egypt and to his son Joseph. Let's remind ourselves of what happens again. It says at the very beginning of verse 1, so Israel took his journey with all that he had, and he came to Beersheba. Certainly been an eventful time for Jacob. The back and forth journeys of his sons as he's sought to gain food for him and his people back in the land of Canaan, to stave off the impact of the famine. The news that then reaches him that his son he thought dead was actually alive, and now the instructions for him and all his household to head down to Egypt. It was an eventful time, and it was a lot for Jacob to take in. But it's a journey that he undertakes. The writer documents that he's commenced his journey. He's now on his way, and he's arrived in Beersheba. Beersheba, which was a place that marked the southernmost boundary of a land that had been given to Jacob's grandfather Abraham and his descendants. A place that would later be used to designate the extent of Israel's land, from Dan to Beersheba, as we read in Judges chapter 20. Jacob has arrived at the extent of the land, beyond his desert, beyond that foreign places, the place that Jacob is heading to, Egypt. And each of the patriarchs at one point or another had lived in Beersheba, had stayed there for a time, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And as such, there was an altar there, an altar to the Lord at which both Abraham and Isaac had worshipped the Lord. Jacob saw these evidences of the land that had been given to Abraham and his descendants, of which Jacob was listed. A reminder that this land had been given to this people, to Abraham and his descendants. And he's on the cusp of embarking a journey in which he would be leaving this land. Leaving a country he knew for a place he didn't know. He'd perhaps heard things about Egypt, perhaps things that unsettled him and disturbed him. But it was about leaving the known for the unknown. To leave a place that represented in a deep way a connectedness to God. For a place that perhaps Jacob feared a disconnect from God. A place that would have been filled with dangers for Jacob. The draw of being reunited with his son has got him on the road. He's making the journey, but it's this point here, just as he's about to leave the land, that it seems to be he's filled with a sense of fear of the unknown, of what lies ahead. Of course, Jacob has felt fear before. He knows what it is to fear. He melted with fear after cheating his brother Esau out of his inheritance and chose to run away. He felt that same sense of fear when 20 years later on the banks of the Jabbok he was due to encounter his brother once again and felt a deep sense of fear. But Jacob has also, by grace of God, learnt a great deal during this time. Learnt what it is to trust God, learnt what it is to handle those fears as we encounter them in life's way. And so without hesitation at this point of the journey, the elderly Jacob takes this chance, despite being filled with fear, to turn to God in worship, to come to the altar with a sacrifice. Let me just read on, see what it says. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And as he worshipped there in that place, it seems appropriate that he did three things. There's a degree of assumption here that I'm making, but I think it's an appropriate assumption to make. First of all, as he offered the sacrifice, he would have confessed the sins of his household. He would have come before the Lord acknowledging his weaknesses, acknowledging his failings, the flaws that he possessed. Second, he would have come to God to give thanks, to recount the blessings, to recount the faithfulness of God. And finally, here at Beersheba, with the journey ahead of him, I think it's fair to say he would have sought God's guidance, to seek the Lord's leading hand as he's about to go on a journey which would be filled with fear, filled with unknowns, that he would have sought the Lord's leading. He would have turned to the Lord and sought that guiding hand and presence, the kind of presence that would later lead Jacob to say, towards the end of the book of Genesis, prior to his death, that the Lord had been like a shepherd to him all the days of his life. This is the leading hand that Jacob now seeks. This is what he has learned. He needs to turn to the Lord in his time of fear and seek his guidance. Jacob had learned this through his fears, that he needed to turn to God. Trouble is, we're sometimes left doubting, wondering whether God will answer, wondering if God has even heard us. Of course, the truth is, God is always more eager to answer than we are often to ask. God is always more eager to guide than we are often eager to follow. But if we're in doubt regarding the truth that God wants to lead us, that God is tender towards us, that our God is the God who would take us by the right hand and guide us, then let us see what happens next for Jacob. And I'm not saying it's going to happen like this for us. I'm not doubting, I'm not denying that God could do this for each of us in our lives, but he does it through declaring it in his word. He gives us a picture of his character, a character that we will discover is consistent entirely. And so this is what happens for Jacob, having sought the Lord in these moments, having come before the altar in worship to the Lord. And it says in verse 2, "And God spoke to Israel, spoke to Jacob in the visions of the night and said, 'Jacob, Jacob.' And he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again. And Joseph's hand shall close your eyes.'" That very night, it seems, God called his servant and spoke to him, called him by name. "Jacob, Jacob." Is it any wonder that Jacob would later describe the Lord as his shepherd, the one who knows him by name, the one who has led him with such tenderness, such care, such affection? And Joseph must have shared this assessment of God. Joseph himself has walked a very different path. The paths of Jacob and Joseph have been divergent in a sense. The Lord has led them in different directions, but the same experience has been the common denominator for them. God has been a shepherd to them, watching over them. No doubt when Jacob said of God that he was a shepherd, Joseph could resonate. Joseph could agree. Joseph could say, "Yes, he's been my shepherd also." And then God, as Jacob is about to depart on this journey from the promised land, from this land that had been promised to Abraham, God reaffirms his covenant with Jacob. "I am God, the God of your father." And it was a reminder to Jacob in these moments that God is a faithful God, and we need to know this. In the face of all that is unknown, we need to know that God is faithful. We need to remind ourselves of the things that are true and that we know and that we can take a hold of, even in the face of the unknown, because every day is filled with unknowns. To us, from our perspective, each and every day is filled with unknowns. And so we need to remind ourselves of what we do know. God reminds his servant at the cusp of leaving this land and heading into a place filled with unknowns that he is a faithful God, can be trusted. And these were the words that reminded Jacob that he could look to the faithfulness of his God in his dealings with Abraham and with his father Isaac, and now also with himself. In other words, God says, "I am a covenant-keeping God. There is a continuity in my character. I am not changing. I am not ceasing to be the one who holds covenant with you." God's character, his faithfulness, cannot and will not be broken. I want you to hear this morning. God will not change on you. He will not cease to be faithful towards you. He will not forsake you. And this is exactly the message. In approaching the unknown, God says to Jacob, I am the constant in your life. My love, my grace, my favor towards you. It is constant because I am a faithful God. And then God speaks directly to Jacob regarding his fearfulness. This is the indicator that there is something that is troubling Jacob in these moments, because God searches the man and he speaks poignantly to the fear he holds. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. And from Jacob's perspective, these words must have been a wonderful relief. The fast changing events of his life haven't changed the promises or plans of God to establish, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a great nation, a people from which one day will come a Messiah for all the nations of the earth. God's promise and plan has not changed. Indeed, far beyond the scope and vision of Jacob, God has been outworking his plan all this time to preserve a people. To preserve a people in the land of Egypt. Not what man would conceive, but God's ways are higher, his plans are greater. And at this point, God fills Jacob in on a few of the blanks. Doesn't give him the details. Doesn't fill him in on everything that's going to happen, but he reasserts his promise, his word. And there's one final aspect to the word that God gives to his servant. And it's the recurring message that God gives to his people. It's the purchase of the fearlessness that we are to possess. God says, I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. Jacob will die down in Egypt, but he will return home. That is God's promise. God will be with him. I will be with you, and I will bring you home, God is saying to his servant Jacob. And I know this is a recurring message, and I know that there have been many times that I've spoken this message from this pulpit, but I think it's recurring for a reason. Because God knows our tendency towards fearfulness, and knows that the antidote is to, in equal measure, remind ourselves of his faithfulness. Fear not, for I am with you. It's a recurring message for us to take a hold of, especially as we countenance the fear of the unknown. Fear not, for I am with you. I will be with you. I will go ahead of you. I will be behind you. I will be with you. And this word that God gives, it doesn't eradicate the unknown. God hasn't sat down with Jacob in these moments and said, look, this is exactly what is going to happen. Step by step, I'm going to walk you through it so you know exactly where you're going and what you're doing and what's going to happen. He's not given that. God hasn't divulged everything that's going to happen. He's not brought Jacob into the fullness of the loop that God has regarding his plans and his purposes. This word doesn't eradicate the unknown, but it would eradicate the fear that is associated with it. That we would be able to step forward in faith and say, Lord, I am trusting you today. I don't know what today is going to bring. I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. I know that there are things that are weighing heavy on my mind, and I don't know how they're going to go. But, Lord, you are faithful. And I'm trusting in you. In your character, in your faithfulness, in your promises, God, in your presence. I'm trusting. In a sense, this message ties in with what we thought about last week when we spoke about the father who said, in my belief, help my unbelief. That here we would have a specific example of how we can turn to the Lord and say, God, would you help me to trust in you for what is ahead today? Because I don't know what's coming. In fact, I'm fearful of what I don't know is coming. Would you help me to trust in you and who you are? And this word, it has an impact upon Jacob. Because it says then Jacob set out from Beersheba. He leaves that place of contact with God that he has known for so long. He leaves the land that has been promised and that which is known and heads off into the unknown. Why? Because God is with him. Because the God that is with him is faithful. And so he sets off. The sons of Israel carried Jacob, their father, their little ones and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They went off on their way. They followed the Lord. They trusted in the Lord at this moment. Jacob and all his household. They felt the full weight of the unknown, but God has reassured of his presence. Do you know, as I close, I was reading about the hymn writer Edith Gilling Cherry. Like many of the hymn writers we discover when we look at their lives, she knew a great difficulty, particularly regarding her health. She had contracted polio as an infant and suffered great disability as she grew older as a result. She lost her sister at the age of 4 when Edith herself was only 6. And as she grew older, she suffered several strokes. The third stroke at the age of 25 killed her. She died at the age of 25. And she had been told that because of her ill health, another stroke would finish her, in a sense, to put it crudely. The doctors had given her the warning. And she was asked regarding the not knowing. How do you live? How do you cope with the not knowing, with in a sense being told that another stroke could finish you? How do you cope with the not knowing? And Edith Gilling Cherry is quoted as saying this: everything in life is unknown except the one who gives life. He has made himself known, and if he is with me, then that is enough. That's a powerful testimony to be able to declare that. At such a young age, to have struggled so much with life, and yet to have been so impacted by the promises of God, to know his presence, and to know his faithfulness, and to know that that is enough even in the face of life's unknowns. And I believe it was that knowledge and understanding that shaped the words that she went on to write. We rest on thee, our shield and our defender. We go not forth alone against the foe, strong in thy strength, safe in thy tender keeping. We rest on thee, and in thy name we go. And I believe it's that carried Jacob. He knew he was going with and in the name of his God, trusting in him, following him. We will face many unknowns in life, but God in his grace has made himself known. And if you are doubting the faithfulness of our God, then look to the cross. Look to Jacob's greater son, the one who came in the line, the one who went to the cross for us, Jesus Christ, to see the full extent of his faithfulness and his love for each and every one of us. We will do in a moment as we come to the emblems. But for a time now, we're going to come to worship the God who says, I am with you and will be with you wherever you go. I'm leading, I'm guiding, and I am faithful to the end. Let us trust in him. Let us worship him. Thanks, Rachel.